Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to The HHABN is Retiring. Now What Forms? I am Colleen Bayard. I'm the Director of Regulatory and Clinical Affairs here at the Home Care Alliance of Massachusetts. For this presentation today, I know Royce had emailed you the webinar as well as two other handouts. One is the new HHABN, and the other one is the HHCCN. So you will need those two forms during the presentation to make it a little easier on you. Today, because there are so many people on the line, we are unable to open the lines for questions. So to ask a question, on the right-hand side of your screen, you will find an area that allows you to put questions in and then hit submit. And I will either try to, depending on time, answer questions as they come in, or we'll do them all at the end of the presentation. So the disclaimer, the Home Care Alliance has produced this material as informational reference for our members. And although every reasonable effort has really been made to assure the accuracy of this information, the Medicare program is constantly changing. So we just request that you keep up to date on the Medicare website, cms.gov. So for the agenda today, we will start with the background. We'll discuss just briefly the history and the necessity of the patient notices, including the COPs. And we will look at the HHCCN for the triggering events, the exceptions to this form, as well as the completion and delivery. And then finally we will discuss the HHABN, the Advanced Beneficiary Notice, those triggering events, completion, and delivery of the HHABN. So the history with the patient notices. This is actually in the section of the COPs 484.10, which is patient rights. So the HHABN actually was required since 2002 to notify the beneficiaries of non-covered charges when there was a limitation of liability. And this patient rights COPs have specific standards, and the one for patient liability is 484.10E. So the home health agency must advise the patient of any care that is going to be initiated or any payments that could be expected from Medicare, Medicaid, or any other insurer. Then in 2006, CMS had to revise the notice in response to a federal court decision, and this was the case of Letwin versus Thompson. And they had to do it to broaden the requirements under the COPs to inform the patient not only of payment liability, but also any change in their plan of care. So this is the COP 484.10, Section C. The patient has the right to be informed in advance about the care to be furnished. So the HHABN is actually being replaced this December 9th, and it's being replaced by two forms. One is the Advanced Beneficiary Notice, the HHABN. Now this form already exists. It is used by other healthcare providers. The form number is CMS-R-131. And to know you have the right form, at the bottom of the left-hand side, it says the form number, and then in parentheses, it should say March of 2011. So it's actually 03/11. So you know you're using the right form. And this is replacing the HHABN's option box 1, which was the liability issue. The next form is a new form developed by CMS, and this is the Home Health Change of Care Notice, HHCCN. The number for this form is 10280, and it is replacing the option box 2 or option box 3. And those option boxes talked about the change in the patient's plan of care. The Medicare Claims Processing Manual in Chapter 30 and Section 60 and all the subsections are being revised according to this new notice. So the HHCCN and the ABN are used only for Medicare fee-for-service. You may begin using the forms immediately if you wish to do so, but you have to do it by December 9th. And you do not need any of these forms for the Medicare Advantage plans. So let's take a look at the new form HHCCN. This is in a change request where all the regulations are. If you want to look at it in detail, it's change request 8403. And when you look at the change request, you'll see a lot of red ink, and that's where the new home health regulations are. So it's pretty easy to read. So the HHCCN is used for one of two purposes. It is that it's for home health aid reasons, or it is because I thought I was having some difficulty with the audio. I'm sorry. The home health aid reasons in option box 2, home health agency reasons in option box 2, or for physician orders. So when it's an agency reason, it could be because you're lacking some availability of staff, or you're closing the home health agency. Maybe there are some safety concerns in the beneficiary's home. When the patient has failed to meet the face-to-face visit requirements with the certifying physician. You cannot give the patient the advanced beneficiary notice because you're not allowed to switch financial liability to the patient when they don't meet the face-to-face. If you do give the option box 2 to a patient, you need to notify the physician, and you also need to notify the patient that they could go to another agency if they wished to do so. The second reason under physician orders is the former box, option box 3 of the HHABN. This is for a reduction or a termination in home health services or items due to a physician order. So the timing of the notice. In the regulations, it really does not say an exact time frame for delivery. It's a bit vague. It does say far enough in advance so beneficiaries may pursue alternatives. However, sometimes you have to give it immediately, and that would be when there is any safety concerns for your staff, or if you had an unforeseen staffing shortage. So the HHCCN has some triggering events, and CMS defines triggering events as any reduction, termination in either care, service, or items. And you're required to issue this form when those triggering events will change the beneficiary's plan of care. So for example, if you're giving this form because of physician orders, there could either be a reduction or a termination. The reduction would be that the plan of care lists wound care as daily, but now the doctor has ordered it every other day. So you would give the form to notify the patient of that decrease. With a termination, the doctor is actually saying that he wants to discharge the wound care altogether and nursing. And PT is still involved in the case. So you would give the patient the HHCCN. If it's due to a home health agency reason, again, it can be either reduction or termination. For reduction, it would be that you have an unexpected staffing shortage and you only can provide PT 2 times a week. Or for termination, if you completely lost your physical therapy staff and you can no longer provide the services at all, you would give the form and you would be checking the second box, which is due to the home health agency reasons. So sometimes you actually could have a multiple change. And what the regulation says is that when multiple care changes occur due to simultaneous order and agency-specific change, you must give the beneficiary 2 separate HHCCNs so they can identify the reason that corresponds to each change. So basically what it's saying is you only can check one of the boxes. So let's just go back a slide. Let's look at this example. So let's say that the doctor ordered nursing every other day. So you would have to give the change of care notice to the beneficiary, fill it out, and you would be checking the first box, which is your doctor's order for your home care has changed. And then simultaneously, you actually lost your physical therapist. So you have to terminate the physical therapy services. So you would give the patient another HHCCN, and you would be checking the second box, which says your home health agency has decided to stop giving you the home care listed above. And again, you have to advise the patient that they could go to another agency if they chose to do so. Okay, so let's get to slide 13. If a patient actually decides to change or reduce services, they decide on their own, you do not need this notice. But it must be in the medical record all the information about the patient's decision. Because the state surveyor, if they don't see an HHCCN when services were reduced, they would be looking in the chart to see the patient's decision. So on slide 14, this is new for the regulations of the notices. This was not, there were no exceptions to when you didn't give the old HHABN. So there are 8 exceptions to that you do not need to notify the patient with the HHCCN. And it is if you are increasing care, if you change your personnel or the caregiver, if you change the time of the visit, if you change the brand. So you kept basically the same item, but it's just your, it's a different manufacturer, maybe for one of the supplies. A change in the length of the visit. And what I mean by that is if a patient starts off with physical therapy and they were 1-hour sessions, as the patient improves, it could go down to 45 minutes. You don't need to give the patient the form for that. And then if reductions are already outlined in the plan of care, so if your order said PT 3 to 5 times a week, and now you're decreasing to 3 times, you do not need to give the patient the notification because it was already in the order. The 7th exception is the change in the mix of service delivered by a specific discipline with no decrease in frequency. That's kind of a mumbo-jumbo, but what that means is that if you've been giving, the nurse has been doing a blood draw and the doctor discharged it, but you've been seeing the patient 3 times a week for wound care, and the wound care continues, you do not need to give this form just because you discharged the blood draw. And then finally, even though we already discussed the change in the beneficiary, if the beneficiary decides, I just wanted to put it on the form for you so you knew all the exceptions. So, instructions for completion. How are we going to fill out this form? So you may want to take out the HHCCN now. And when you're completing the form, there are 3 sections, the header, the body, and then finally the signature page. I mean the signature and the date at the end of the page. So in the header, which is at the top, just above the title, you have your agency's name, address, a phone number, and a TTY number, which is for text phone numbers for the device for the deaf. And you would put the patient's full name. You see patient identification there. It is an optional field. You do not need to put anything there. However, if you want to put the patient's medical record number, or if the patient has an electronic barcode that you use, that is permissible to do so. But do not use the Medicare number or the Social Security number. So the body of the form has 5 components: the date, the items in service, the reason for the change, the check boxes that are in the middle, and then the additional information section. So in the body of the form, kind of self-explanatory, the date that the change begins in the plan of care. And then the items of service description of the specific reduction or termination. So you could have, on the day that you're going to change the services, on November 23rd, 2013, the frequency of your wound care will decrease to 3 days per week. That would be in that item service box. Or it could be that you will be stopping all of the occupational therapy. Or it could be that your wound supplies will be decreased, your daily wound supplies will be decreased to 3 days a week. So those are some examples of the items or services that could be listed in this section of the form. The next section on the right, the reason for change, you have to give the patient the reason that you're changing. So some examples would be your doctor has changed your order for nursing, your doctor has ordered occupational therapy be discontinued. For reasons that are the home health agency reasons, it could be that your dog has been threatening to our staff and we are unable to safely enter your home. Or if the patient did not meet the face-to-face requirement, your example could be you did not have a face-to-face encounter to meet payment eligibility. We will no longer be able to provide home health services. And those examples that I gave you, I changed them a little bit, but they are exactly what the regulations say in Change Request 8403. Next, in the body of the form, there is that section, the 2 boxes. And you have to pick one of the boxes because whatever you list, and as I had said before, if there were 2 reasons, you'd have to give 2 HHCCNs. But usually I'm guessing you're just going to check 1. The next section is additional information. This is an optional area, but if there's any information that could make it helpful so the patient understands this better, you could put that information in this section. If they were a little upset that the doctor had decreased the nursing, you could put the physician's name and phone number if the patient wished. And if the patient needed language assistance, if they spoke a different language and you had an interpreter there, you could put in this body, in the additional information section, the language assist that was used. So I'm just going to close this for now, and I'm going to take a look at the HHCCN. So what I have done, well, that's really large. Let me just make that a little smaller. I took off all of the labels. No, this one doesn't have the labels. I take that back. So I put in the date, November 22nd, and then on November 22nd, we will stop all home health services. And this is for a safety reason. Your dog has been threatening our staff. And then you would go down and check this box. Unfortunately, my computer won't let me check it, so I just highlighted it for you. But you're told in the regulations to have the patient actually read the box, the information in the box, because you're telling them that they actually can have a different home health agency if they have a valid home health order, and if you need help finding a different agency, that they should contact their doctor. And also that they could get a different home health agency and ask to bill Medicare. So the regulations ask you to do that. The other example that I've used is this one is because of an MD order. So the physician is saying stop all physical therapy. And then the reason is you have met your physical therapy goals and no additional services are needed. Therefore, you would be checking the top box. The physician orders for your home care have changed. And again, the regulations say that the patient, oops, I'm sorry, I'm going to make this a little smaller. Your patient should read this for understanding. And then I probably would put the doctor's name and phone number in the additional information section. Then once you explain all this to the patient, they would sign and then date the form. Okay, let's go back to the PowerPoint. Okay. So the signature and date, I had just mentioned that. That's the final section. The beneficiaries or representatives must sign and date. So the agency actually could insert the date for the beneficiary if the beneficiary is having difficulty doing so and they request that assistance. Your clinician, though, would have to actually annotate that on the side of the document that they were requested to put in the date. If the patient has a representative, for that signature, you must indicate it as rep or representative right next to the signature. If that representative signature doesn't look legible, you should have your clinician ask the person to print their name next to the signature. Just a little bit more information on signatures that were in the regulation. If a patient is physically unable to sign, but they're capable of understanding, then you do not need a representative to sign the form. And so the patient is actually allowing the clinician to sign the form in their behalf. And the clinician would have to annotate that directly on the form. So the example of this would be that the patient has 2 broken arms, and the staff person will sign and date in the presence of the patient, inserting the beneficiary's name alongside their own. So if I was the clinician going out, I would be Colleen Bayard, PT, from the Home Health Agency, signed for Jane Doe. And it says in the regulation it should be witnessed by a second person if possible. And of course, in the medical record, it's going to support that the patient has 2 broken arms and the inability to sign. I'm not sure how much that happens. So in circumstances when a patient refuses to sign the HHCCN, you must write that the beneficiary refused to sign on the notice itself. And you're going to give a copy of that annotated notice right to the beneficiary. So you're going to say that they refused to sign and they receive a copy. This is specifically spelled out in the CMS Internet-Only Manual, Medicare Claims Processing Manual, Chapter 30, and it is in Section 60.4G.4. So for instructions of delivery for the HHCCN, you're really required to explain the entire notice and answer all of the questions for the patient. You really have to make every effort before they sign this form that they understand what this is all about. The regulations say that abbreviations should be avoided, but it also goes on to say unless the abbreviation is spelled out elsewhere and you have explained the meaning. I'd be a little cautious about that. I would just try to avoid abbreviations because I know so many agencies had problems with that last year. If verbal assistance on the was provided, that should be in the additional information section showing your due diligence to explain this to the beneficiary. And then an in-person delivery is preferred, however, it is not required by the regulation. The regulation says that you could actually telephone call the patient, but you can't just leave a message on an answering machine. You have to have a response from that patient. So the form would be validated, and then you would immediately follow that up by sending out the form saying that you contacted by phone, and either hand deliver it or send it in the mail that evening. So that's pretty much the HHCCN. Now let's start talking about the advanced beneficiary notice. It's a little bit more cumbersome, I think, so you might want to take out that form. So the HHABN is always used for potential financial liability, and it must be signed prior to giving any care. It's usually used when services are usually covered by Medicare, but in this instance may not be covered. So that would be for medical necessity, the patient's not homebound, there's not skilled nursing on an intermittent basis, or the care is custodial. Now on this slide, I actually printed this from the regulations specifically. And when you look at the form, if you look at the form now, there's 3 boxes almost across the first third of the page. And it says in the second box, reason Medicare may not pay. In the regulations, CMS has written these recommended examples for reasons why Medicare would not pay. So they recommended them. You probably can just use them. So for reasonable and necessary, Medicare is saying to use Medicare does not pay for care that is not medically reasonable and necessary. The second one for custodial care, Medicare does not usually pay for custodial care except for some hospice services. The third is Medicare requires that a beneficiary cannot leave home, with certain exceptions, in order to cover services under the home health benefit. And then the fourth, Medicare requires part-time or intermittent need for skilled nursing care in order to cover services under the home health benefit. So if you decide to pre-print these forms, you may be able to use this language that Medicare is recommending. It is recommending it. They are not saying that you have to use it, but you would use similar language to this. So there's triggering events also in the HHABN. And it can be for initiation of service, reduction, or termination. And initiation is when you start the care and right away you do not think that Medicare would cover these services, especially if it's, for example, a duly eligible patient and they are not homebound. And for the reduction, when you expect that Medicare coverage of an item, a supply, or services will be reduced or stopped during the illness while others are continuing, that would be a reduction. And this includes when one home health discipline ends, but others are continuing. And then finally, termination is when you expect that all Medicare coverage will end for all items and services. So let's just give an example of a reduction. You have a homebound patient who is receiving nursing 3 times a week for the first few weeks, and then they decide to reduce to 2 times a week as the patient is improving. But the patient doesn't want that decrease. They want to continue 3 times a week, but the nurse has explained that this additional visit is not medically necessary. So the patient must be notified that these services wouldn't be covered by Medicare and that that person would be financially liable, is when you would give the form. And I actually, after I go through a few more slides, I have an example of a HHABN that I filled out for a patient who would private pay. If all services are discharged, if the termination involves all Medicare coverage services, you're actually giving the Medicare, the notice of Medicare non-coverage, Form 10123. You do not need a separate HHCCN to be issued in this circumstance. However, if you think that the patient wants to continue with the care, possibly private pay or billed to their Medicaid, then you would also issue the HHABN as well as the notification of non-coverage. So let's look at instructions for completing the ABN. So in this form, there are 10 blanks. A through J are labeled on the form. And you actually can remove those letters prior to filling out the form, or if you're going to have your forms pre-printed, you actually can take them off. They're on for instructional use only. So blanks A through F at the top may be filled out by the clinician in advance, as well as H, which is additional information. Blanks G, I, and J would be completed by the patient. And the entries actually may be typed, but they also may be handwritten. So let's look at the blanks. So blank A is the home health agency's name, address, and phone number. Pretty self-explanatory. And then B is the patient's name, and the first and the last name need to be on the note. It's not just an initial in the last name. They could say that might be invalid. And if the instructions do say if there's initial on the Medicare card, you should include that on the form. And then blank C is the identification number. Just like in the HHCCN, this is an optional field, but you could use the medical record number. But as a reminder, you cannot put the Medicare number or the Social Security number there. Blank D, when you look at the form, there's a lot of blank Ds, and they're all over the form. In the top, it says note. There's 2 blank Ds there. And then in the header to the left of where it says reason Medicare may not pay, there's another blank D. What you need to know section, there's a blank D there. And in the G option sections, there are 3 Ds there. Excuse me, sorry. The general descriptors can be used in this blank D. You could use the word item, service, care. The regulations give a lot of other examples, procedure, test, equipment. But in home care, we probably wouldn't be using those. We're probably just using items or services. On the next slide, we're continuing with D. And this is the blank that is underneath the header for D. This is where so it's the first box on the left. This is where you need to be specific about the care that may not be covered, including the frequency and duration, if it's repetitive or continuous non-covered. So for example, if a home health aide was going to be placed 3 times per week for 1 year, nursing visits weekly for 1 year, physical therapy visits twice a week for 4 weeks, occupational visits weekly for 8 weeks, or wound care supplies monthly for 3 months. In E is the reason for medical that Medicare may not pay, and you must have at least one reason applicable to each item that's in section D. But the same reason may apply to multiple items. So if you're changing nursing and home health aid, each one of them will have because the patient is not homebound. And under E, it is suggested to use the CMS reasons that I provided back on slide 29. Now, blank F is estimating the cost of each service. And the regulations say, and that I italicized, it's quoted from the regulation, that the cost estimate must be a good faith estimate based on agency charges and the expected frequency and duration of each service. So the cost estimate per visit, it could be per hour, which would be for an aide, or per number of visits weekly are acceptable, including information on time period if it's appropriate. So these are the examples that actually, the 4 examples on the slide came from the Claims Processing Manual, Section 30-50.14.4. So they give examples of $440 for 4 weekly nursing visits in the month of January. Nursing visits daily for 1 year at $125 each. $260 for 3 physical therapy visits for a week in January. And $50 for a right arm splint. The regulation also goes on to say that they want you to estimate within $100 or at least 25% of the actual cost, because it is allowing the patient to be able to determine any out-of-pocket cost to them. In blank G, this is the section that the beneficiary or representative chooses to fill out. And if there are multiple services listed in blank D, but the beneficiary wants only some of them, you might have to give multiple ABNs. If the beneficiary refuses to select one of the choices, and they possibly could, then you need to document that on the form. The home health agency may enter beneficiary selection if the patient, however, is just physically unable to do so. So if the patient says, I want you to check option box 2, the staff could do that because the patient verbalized the option. But you would have to annotate that appropriately on the form. Oh, and let me just go back to the slide for a moment. If the patient refuses to mark an option and you write that, or they refuse to sign, you still have to give them a copy of that annotated ABN. So let's talk about Section G, which is the options section. And this has gotten a little confusing over the past couple of months, because when this regulation first came out, Medicare was saying that for the duly eligible, you would be checking option 1, but the state would be billing Medicare up front. And that's not what we do in Massachusetts. So there was kind of a lot of back and forth between CMS and the states. So this is what the final rule is now on this regulation. And I received a transmittal from Mass Health this Monday also. So for option 1, this actually indicates the choice to bill Medicare. And you would do this if the patient has a secondary insurance that wants a denial for Medicare, or if the patient actually wants the demand billing process. And if there is a secondary insurance, in that section H, which is additional information, you would include specific information on the secondary insurance, or you could actually leave it blank and ask the beneficiary to insert the secondary insurance. But you are allowed to put that there. You may pre-print some language in this additional section. For example, the regulation says, we will submit a claim for this care to your other insurance, and then you would leave a blank there and you would fill in what the name of the other insurer is. So option 2, this is the option that Massachusetts providers will be filling out for your patients who are duly eligible. I received on, I said Monday, but it actually was Tuesday, from Mass Health clarification on the ABN for the duly eligible. Oh, I guess 18 was Monday. Yeah, sorry about that. So this is what they said exactly. I italicized it because this is what was in the transmittal. The new ABN form does not allow a dual eligible beneficiary to choose the option to bill Medicaid. And it doesn't. It doesn't say it anywhere. Therefore, you should direct the beneficiary to choose option 2. under Section H, which is the additional information section, you should pre-print the following language. We will bill your Medicaid plan. We will bill Medicare only if your Medicaid plan instructs us to do so. What this is allowing for Mass Health to stay the payer of last resort, and it also gives them the right to exercise any appeal rights to Medicare because they put it in the additional information section. So this is what option 2 looks like. I could see why a patient may not want to fill it out. It says, I want the services listed above, but do not bill Medicare. You may ask to be paid now as I am responsible for payment. I cannot appeal if Medicare is not billed. So this option allows the beneficiary to receive the non-covered items of service and pay for them out of pocket, and no claim would be filed and Medicare will not be billed. Thus, there is no appeal associated with this. So when I first read it and I contacted CMS, they told me to follow whatever the state directive was. And so the state directive was the previous slide that I just read to you. This is in writing now, and this is the process for Massachusetts to do. And I especially suggest that you really do pre-print these forms. I can't imagine your clinicians remembering exactly to say, we will bill your Medicaid plan, you know, we will bill Medicare only if your Medicaid plan instructs us to do so. I think you need to be very careful with that language. You don't want to have any problems saying that your form is invalid. So in option 2, as I had said, this is just a little, I might have covered all this. Medicare, we don't bill up front, and that's what happens in option 1. And this is, and we may direct duly eligible patients to choose the correct option box according to state directives. When you read the regulations, it says that we are not supposed to coach the patient in any way to decide upon option 1, 2, or 3. However, it is allowed to help the patient if there is a state directive to choose a specific box for proper billing under the Mass Health. So that's what that's all about. Then finally, there's option 3, and I know a lot of folks have told me they've had some confusion with this. I myself emailed CMS when this regulation first came out. So it says, I do not want the services listed above. I understand that with this choice I am not responsible for payment, and I can not appeal to see if Medicare would pay. Now, if the patient doesn't want it, the regulation in another section says, then you don't fill anything out. They don't want it, they don't need it, then you're not billing anything. There's no financial involved at all. So I asked CMS to give me an example for home care, because I do understand that this is used for other payers and providers. And the answer I got back was that they really couldn't think of an example for home care, but they have to give the patient the option to be able to say no and to put it in writing. So, you know, you may or may not be using this option box 3 very much. So let's get down to blank H on the form. That's the additional information section. And as I showed you before, the example, this first bullet, this is what Mass Health has advised us to put in that section. And then if you're choosing box 1, option 1, excuse me, then you would be putting in the secondary insurance information in that box. Blank I and J are the signatures. Must be signed by the beneficiary or the representative. And if the beneficiary refuses to choose an option or to sign the HHABN when required, You must annotate that on the original form. And if there are witnesses, it says you should get a witness, although it is not required. It also says in the same statement. But the regulation states, and I'm quoting this is exactly from the regulation, if a beneficiary refuses to sign a properly delivered HHABN, the home health agency should consider not furnishing the items or services unless the consequences, health and safety of the patient, or civil liability in a case of harm are such that this is not an option. In any case, you still have to provide a copy of that annotated HHABN to the beneficiary, and you would keep the original in the patient's chart. Section J is just the date that the form is signed. If a patient is having difficulty writing the date, oh, I have a typo there. Sorry about that. It's supposed to say the home health agency may add. Looks like the S and D are pretty close on my keyboard. I apologize. You may add the date if assistance is requested. So let's take a look at the form. I'm going to leave this slide, show, and we'll take a look at the HHABN for private pay. So I made this one up for the patient who wants to continue that extra nursing visit, and it's only going to be for about 4 weeks. So I did take off all of the lettered labels, A through J, and then I put in the name of my agency and the patient's name, and I made up a medical record number. And then section D, I specifically highlighted for you. That's the only reason why it's highlighted. This is there's 7 of them all together. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then in the services, which is section D, you're supposed to explain the service. So I wrote the visiting nurse 1 time a week for 4 weeks. And I specifically used the Medicare language that was on slide 29 about reasonable and necessary. And I estimated that it would cost $100 per visit. Now, this patient, because they're willing to private pay, they are going to select the second option box. And that says, do not bill Medicare. You may ask to be paid now. I am responsible for payment. They are going to pay you. And then I don't really think you need any additional information. And then you could put and ask the patient. So the patient checks themselves, option 2, and then they sign and date the form. Also, I did fail to say this when I was talking about all the sections. This disclaimer in here, the form number, and all of these numbers must be kept on the HHABN. If it is not there, they actually consider the form to be invalid. So just a reminder about that. And then lastly, I made up a sample of a patient that would be duly eligible. Now in this one, I don't know if you've noticed, and I didn't go over the exact directions with you, but the rules and regulations say that if you pre-print forms, you can identify them in multiple ways. You could put a number at the top, so number 1 stands for duly eligible. I put TPL in. You could have wrote DE for duly eligible. It could be in a cream color sheet, whatever, but I just put that there. And again, I highlighted the 7 Ds, and I put the word in service because that's, I don't know if you remember that slide, but it said items, services, or care. So that's the descriptor that I used. And then you're going to pre-print. This is the exact statement. I highlighted it so you could see it a little bit more easily. That's the exact statement that was on that payment notice that I received from Mass Health this week. So you may explain to the patient that they need to check option box 2, but I would specifically point out the additional information that says we are billing his or her Medicaid, and then we will bill Medicare if Medicaid instructs us to. And then you can just, same thing. I use the reasons that Medicare gave. I changed the numbers a little bit. And then just have the patient sign and date. And in this case, same as in private pay, they're checking option 2. Okay, we're nearing the end. Hope everyone's doing okay. I'm not sure if we have any questions yet. I lost my little question box somehow. The next section, oh, I did this section already. I'm sorry. So the period of effectiveness. Assigned ABN for services not covered by Medicare are effective up for 1 year. And as long as you don't change the care. So if you do change the care, of course, in any way, you would have to do a new ABN. The duly eligible patient receives care from Medicaid. That's all that they're getting. You don't change anything. Then at the end of the year, you give a new ABN to the patient. So if you gave the patient the ABN last year on November 30th, nothing has changed, you kept nursing in there once a week that whole time, that form would be effective through November 29th. Where are the questions? If you be patient with me for one moment, I just received a notice from Royce that we do have some questions coming in. And oh, there's my question box. Okay. I think what I'll do, because I've missed them, it probably will be a little bit more efficient for me just to answer them all, but I can go back to the slides if need be. Okay, so I finished that slide. Continuing with the period of effectiveness. This is an example. So if you have been providing one non-covered service and then you add another one, you would give the patient a new ABN for that additional service. So this is a duly eligible patient who has been receiving nursing services for 3 months. And now the patient, and the patient's not homebound, and now the patient needs home health aid services. So you're going to give the patient another ABN just with the home health aid information. And then in 9 months from now, you will do a new ABN, but this time you will put nursing and the home health aid on it. You cannot backdate the ABN. If they ever thought you backdated it, it would be considered invalid. If you do not complete the ABN, if you left specific boxes or items left blank or filled out improperly, it is provider liable. And we certainly don't want to have any problems with that, especially with a patient, a duly eligible patient. The regulation does say that it's not necessary for a nurse or a therapist to be giving the patient the ABN. Anyone from the home health agency office who is appointed could do so, as long as they can answer all of the questions, they understand the billing process, or any question that the patient may have. An agency could have someone else in the office give the patient the ABN. The option boxes, according to regulation, they are choosing only one of the three. And it does say, under no circumstances can you decide for the beneficiary which one to check, except if it's a directive from the state. And if you decide that you're going to pre-print a form, especially like the TPL form that I had, do not pre-select the checkbox 2. If you did so, it would be invalid, and you don't even want to chance that. You have to leave those blank, and the patient would have to check that number 2 on their own. But of course, you know, if they're unable to physically do it, I've mentioned this before, your agency personnel can do it, but they just have to annotate that correctly. I did hear from an agency a few months back that they were denied because it said that the patient did not date the notice, that it looked like the clinician did. And it certainly didn't look like the patient wrote the date. I don't know who wrote the date, but you would have to annotate that the date was added by the clinician and have the clinician document their name. So according to the regulations, and I took this right from the regulation for you to have as a reference, they're saying for this to be a valid HHABN, there are some delivery requirements. That you're delivering this to a capable recipient and they're comprehending it. You're using the correct notice with all the blanks completed. You're delivering it to the beneficiary in person, if possible, but it's not required. You could do it, like I said, by phone and follow up by mail. Provided far enough in advance for delivering potentially non-covered services so they have sufficient time to consider their options. However, that is not required. And then explain in its entirety all the beneficiary-related questions are answered timely and accurately before they sign that form. And then, of course, the form has to be signed and dated. So these are instructions that pertain both to the HHCCN and the HHABN. And it's basically for thoughts about for pre-printing. So you are allowed to customize this according to the instructions. If you pre-print forms, they actually can be in different colored paper as long as you use high contrast combination. So what that means is you're using dark ink on a light color, either a cream or a white. And you may label pre-printed versions by adding letters or numbers up in that header section, like I did when I added the TPL. What you can't do is reverse printing. And what I mean by that is that you have like a white or a very light yellow ink on dark paper. That is not allowed, and they would say that the HHABN is invalid. It has to be able to be easily read by the patient. The agency may pre-print descriptions as well in some common scenarios if they have a lot of wound care. And an example that they gave right in the regulation is beginning on, you leave it blank, you put the date, we will decrease the frequency of your wound care to blank times per week. They are allowing you to do that. If you do pre-print, they're saying it has to be 12 font. However, they will allow 10 font in some of the smaller areas to get all of the information, and if you have a lot to write in those areas. You are also permitted to list multiple change of care scenarios. The regulations, and I just looked at it again before this meeting, before this webinar, you may use checkboxes to identify information applicable to the scenario. And alternatively, for those items, you could either circle it or items that you do not want, you put a single line through. I quoted this from the manual. If checkboxes are used to identify change pertaining to a specific discipline within the home health agency, an explanation of what is changing must be included. For example, if a checkbox next to physical therapy is marked, text such as reduced to 2 times per week must be inserted. Just checking off a discipline without an explanation would render the notice invalid. So some more instructions. Of course, you need 2 copies, one for the beneficiary, one for the home health agency. The home health agency always keeps the original. CMS is allowing electronic issuance. They hadn't in the past, but they are now. So it may be viewed on an electronic screen and signed if the patient is agreeable. If the patient does not want to sign on that screen, the regulation says they don't have to, and you would have to give them the paper option instead. The signature of the patient, it is allowed if it's digitally captured, but you must give the patient a paper copy of that signed form as soon as possible. The length of the page size. It can't exceed 1 page in length, and I'll be honest with you, when I was playing with let's see what form it was. I think it was the home health change of care notice. I was having a little difficulty getting it all on the same line. No, actually it might have been the ABN. So just be careful with that. You are allowed to use legal size paper, however, if you want to get all of your information in. Oh, and I had already mentioned this, the contrast of the paper. It's dark ink on light background. The font type. CMS wants you to download the form specifically from their website and use that font. However, some agencies have software, and the forms are in the software, and they're limited to other font types, such as Arial, Narrow, Times Roman, Courier. And CMS is saying if you do have software issues or limitations, excuse me, you can use those fonts. Don't change the style of the font in any way. No italics, embossing, bold. I had to actually catch myself from when I was making those samples not to bold some items. And basically what it's saying, it's making the ABN as well as HCCN just more difficult to read. The font size, I talked about this, it's 12 point. Titles can be 14 to 16. And the blanks may be typed or legible handwriting. So that's it. I wanted to give you some resources. This first bullet of the beneficiary notices, HHCCN and ABN. When you click on this website, it takes you to the beneficiary notice page. And at the very top, you actually see HHCCN underlined, so you would click on that link, and then it opens up some zip files. So the English is there, the Spanish versions are there. You want the Word documents. They also have them in PDF form. The regulation is there. The change request is there for both the HHCCN and the ABN. It's a really good resource. And of course, I talked about the COP, so I put that in. And then feel free to use this email. It's an email for questions for both the ABN or HHCCN. This is the email address. So it's revised ABN, and then I don't know if you can see it, but there is an underscore right here. And then ODF, which is Open Door Forum, at cms.hhs.gov. Okay, so for questions, I am just going to take them from the top here. So if supplies are decreased to change in level of care, are 2 forms needed? I think what you're asking is on the home health change of care notice. I would, and it's for the same reason, you're changing the care. Change in the level of care, 2 forms needed. So this is what I think that this person is asking me. I think they're asking that if you're decreasing nursing, and therefore you're also decreasing the wound supplies. You do not need 2 forms. What you would do is on the home health change of care notice under items services, you would be saying we are decreasing your nursing to 3 times a week, and the reason is, and you would write the reason, your wound is improving, whatever. And then the next, right underneath that, I would say we are decreasing your wound supplies from daily to twice a week, and the reason for that change is it's the same reason. Basically, your wound is improving. The only time you need 2 different forms is if the doctor ordered something and then the agency was doing something, you know, because it was a staffing shortage or something like that. Loretta, if that does not answer your question correctly, please type another one in for me. Oh, thank you. The next question is, in the past, we had not been able to use a general reason for discharge. You have met your goals. Has this changed? Well, actually, I took those reasons, general reasons, right from the CMS example that I received. But I actually can check into that further. It doesn't say specifically general reasons for discharge. I'm assuming you're meaning on the home health change of care notice. But that's what the example I had. It did say therapy goals were met and additional services were not needed. But I will look into that further. A lot of questions here. People had problems with their phones. Sorry about that. Question, is electronic signature acceptable? Yes, it is. That was asked early. But it is acceptable to have a patient's electronic signature. You just need to give them a copy of the forms. When you utilize the form for items, is this if you discharge supplies and the patient wants you to continue to order? Please define items under home health change of care notice triggering events. Items is not defined by CMS. What it does do is in change request 8403, it gives you examples of what items are. I have the manual in front of me. I'm just trying to get it right now. Let me see. Oh, actually, in the home health, let me read this question again. Utilizing, please define items in the home health change of care notice triggering events. So, according to this, it says that it just says items of service. You must explain whether the item or service is being reduced or terminated. And they just give an example. It doesn't give an example of an. It just says your frequency of your wound care will decrease to 3 days per week. That's what they say for item. And then services, we will stop all of your occupational therapy services. So this is in change request 8403 that information is in. Do you have to remove the letters? No. That can certainly help the nurses. No, you do not have to. It's just suggested. The next one says, Sally Rosiello gave instructions that, and Sally Rosiello, by the way, she's the educator for NGS, and she has recently done a few webinars on these new forms. So this question says, if we could put the, let's see, she gave instructions that we could put the frequency and include as needed for 1 year. Do I think that's okay? Well, I'll be honest with you. I heard her say that and I was kind of taken aback because throughout these forms it says that the patient will be able to estimate the costs of these things. And I could see that coming back to bite us by saying define as needed. I suppose you said, if you said almost like you were doing a PRN order, as needed for 1 or 2 extra visits a month because of whatever, that might be a little bit more reasonable. But I think I would shy away from that until you had further clarification. What is the difference between a reduction in service on the CCN and the ABN? Well, the ABN reduction is because the services, the same reductions. I mean, you're reducing the services. So I gave an example of you'd see the patient 3 times a week and you're decreasing to 2. You would notify the patient with the HHCCN that you're decreasing. The patient doesn't want any more service. They're in agreement. They're going down. But with the ABN, the patient wants the other visit. They want that 3rd visit, and there's a payment liability issue. So that's what the difference between those two are. If you have a patient sign the new form already, it is effective until when? If it's for a long-term issue and it's a duly eligible, it is effective until 1 year. I actually emailed CMS to clarify that. If a patient is recerted with a reduction in services from the previous certification, is the HHCCN still required? Yes. It was in the regulations for these forms have not really changed. It's just the way you're filling them out. But that was a regulation before, and it is still a regulation now. If you've changed the frequency when you're doing a recert, you do need the HHCCN. That's a good question. What about our old ABNs? Are they good until they expire? Yes. Some go into the end of 2014, November 2014. Yes, I asked that question, and I was told that yes, they were still good. Because I thought, and I had emailed CMS, do we have to give everyone new forms in December of 2013, even previous patients? And the answer was no. Why is there no space for clinician's signature issuing the form on any of the forms? I don't know. I didn't make these regulations up. But if they're writing on the form, they have to write their, if they're annotating, they should be putting their name on the form, even if you're writing up the side of the form. When you resume a patient to services following a hospital stay, and the frequency is reduced from the start of care, is an ABN required? I would say yes, because that's the way that it used to be. The regs haven't changed. Is a new ABN required at a resumption of care? That's kind of the same question. I'm assuming if you're decreasing what you originally told the patient, you haven't, still the same plan of care, but now you're reducing the care, I would say that it would. With the HHABN, we would complete the form when the patient had an order for PT eval and the eval found no skill, and the patient only received a one-time PT visit. I don't believe we will need to give out a form for this reason anymore. Am I correct? I'm not sure what you're asking, I'm assuming you're just billing the Medicare and you're not going back. You've told the patient you're not going back. I don't know why you would have been giving the form anyway. No, I think you are correct. You wouldn't be giving the form out. Is the Medicare non-coverage form changing? Not to my knowledge. What happened to the dark on light contrast in order to be able to see? You do have to put dark ink on light paper. That still is a regulation. I think it's in one of my ending slides, but you can't do the reverse. You can't use dark paper with white ink. And the reason behind that is the government says it's too difficult to read. What is the process for having a representative sign the form who is not present to sign? Can we call the representative and record that notification on the form? If we then mail a copy of this form to the representative for signature and it is not returned by the representative, do we consider ourselves as having an ABN or HHCN? What you have to do is actually spelled out in the regulation. If you called the representative, you must have verbal contact back. You are not allowed to just leave an answer on an answering service. And if that representative said to you, yes, okay, whatever your reason was, whether it was a decrease or you're discharging, and then you mail it out that evening, and you give them a self-return envelope, the regulation says that you have to make some more. If it doesn't come back, you have to make other attempts to get that form. Doesn't say how many. I would guess more than 2 attempts, maybe 3 in total, but again, it doesn't say. It just says you have to show that you made more attempts. Can we get a copy of the sample forms? Oh, sure. Just to clarify, for all duly eligible patients, is option box 2 on the ABN always the box to check off? Yes, it is. That's what Mass Health told me today. And honestly, I didn't know that answer up until this week. I really had no idea. But it is true. It is option box 2. But you have to put that additional information on the form to make it valid, you know, that 2-sentence phrase that was on one of the slides. Do we have to provide a TTY number on both forms or only write on form when necessary? The instruction seems to allude that you would write it on the form when necessary. On February 17, 2011, ABN CMS teleconference question 4 stated effective 2/3/12 ranges can be used. Is this still the case? Also, could describe frequency as needed, and this is still the case. I have not heard that. You're saying from CMS. I think, and I had a question above this, I did hear Sally Rosiello say as needed. And as I said previously, it just makes me think that, you know, and it also says you have to be within $100. So, or 25% of the actual cost. That leaves me a little uncomfortable. So probably the best bet is to email that question to that email address that I gave you on the last slide. And I'll probably end up doing it myself because I'd like to find the answer out. Okay, I hope I get through all these questions. I'll try. Let me see. On the NGS website, they mention the use of ranges on ABN. Oh, here we go again. I don't know. I'm going to have to find that out. again, I have another one. Same thing. Same question. Let's see. December 13th, 2012. Teleconference with CMS. Question 3 states, frequency and duration does not have to be listed and acceptable to just list disciplines, i.e. nursing. Is this still the case? No. The regulation clearly says that you need frequency and duration. It's written right on the form. And if you look at the change request, either 8403 or 8404, depending upon which form you're looking at, Melissa, it says it's frequency and duration. And again, the thinking behind that is the patient has to know up front how much they're going to have to pay, if they have to pay. Even if it's duly eligible, they expect you to do that. Can I get a copy of these slides or handouts for this webinar? The person who asked that, they should have received it. It was in the email that Royce sent out 2 days ago. If you still do not have it, shoot Royce an email. If electronically signed, can be sent a copy. Wait a minute. If electronically signed, can we send a copy of this to the patient the following day, or do we have to give a copy of the completed form at the time of signing? I would say that if it's electronically signed and if the patient has any questions whatsoever, I would hand them a copy of one of the forms that you have, so they know what they checked, they know what it was all about, and then you can just send it to them the next day. Or ask them their permission, you know, do you understand all this? Is it okay? I send it to you the next day. I know an agency had an issue with that, with the notice of non-coverage. They had to give the patient the notice. They were instructed to, by the QIO, to give a paper copy because they couldn't print it off for the patient. But that was the notification of non-coverage. It doesn't clearly state that anywhere in any of the regulations that I read. We be able to view this webinar again? Yes. Royce is recording it. I just don't know when that's going to be ready. Where can we get the new HHCCN form? Actually, I sent one to everyone, but they are on those websites. On the first website that I gave you, the forms are there. You would want to use the Word document form so you could do the editing. Clarification, please. Which form is to be used when one discipline is discharging and the other remains? You are using, for one discipline discharge, and someone's still in there, the HHCCN. That's the form that you would use. If pre-printed statement is put under additional information for the duly eligibles, can we put a checkbox and use the same form for all 3 options? However, only check the box if the patient is selecting option 2. Wait, am I going to read that again? If a pre-printed statement is put under additional information for the duly eligibles, can we put a checkbox and use the same form for all 3 options? However, only check the box if the patient is selecting option 2. I'm not sure why you would put that additional information in. I'm not sure what you're really asking me. So if you want to shoot me off an email, Mary Ellen, or call me and we can chat about it. I'm not sure what you're asking. I apologize. Is the new HHABN required when the patient is resumed without no change in their plan of care? I'm assuming the patient was in the hospital and now they're coming out of the hospital. And I would almost question, you know, are they homebound for a little bit? Why aren't you billing Medicare? It's kind of a lot of questions to that. Maybe if you want to email me specifically what you're asking for, that would be helpful. I think this is the last question. On recert, if we give a new service plan and consent form, would this not cover the change in the plan of care? On recert, if we give a new service plan. Yeah, well, I think it would cover it. If that's your process, you know, the patient's signing their service agreement, you're telling them, you're getting their signature, it is a plan, you have new orders, and that's your process. I think that's acceptable. Okay, that's it for the questions. So I want to thank everyone. I hope you found this helpful. Royce did record it, and he will be emailing folks when that is ready. Royce just came in and told me it takes about two days or so, so probably the beginning of next week. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening. Bye-bye now.